Now we're going to talk about a classic study of conformity conducted by Solomon Asch. First I'll show you a video and then we'll talk more about it.
It examines behavior under the pressure of social forces, as the experiment of Solomon Asch reveals.
The experiment you'll be taking part in today involves the perception of lengths of lines. As you can see here, I have a number of cards, and on each card there are several lines. Your task is a very simple one. You're to look at the line on the left and determine which of the three lines on the right is equal to it in length. All right, we'll proceed in this order. You'll give your answer.
Only one of the people in the group is a real subject, the fifth person with the white T-shirt. The others are confederates of the experimenter and have been told to give wrong answers on some of the trials. The experiment begins uneventfully as subjects give their judgments.
2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 3, 3, 3, 3.
And on the third trial, something happens.
2, 2, 2, 2, 2.
The subject denies the evidence of his own eyes and yields to group influence.
1.
Asch found subjects went along with the group on 37% of the critical trials. But he found through interviews that they went along with the group for different reasons.
1. 1. They must be right. There are 4 of them and 1 of me. 1.
This subject's yielding is based on a distortion of his judgment. He genuinely believes that the group is correct.
1. 1. 1. 2. 1. 2. 2. 2.
I know they're wrong, but why should I make waves?
2.
In this case, the subject knows he is right, but goes along to avoid the discomfort of disagreeing with the group. Here, the distortion is at the level of his response.
2. 2. 2. 2.
In the previous experiment, the naive subject stood alone against the group. In this variation, Asch gave the naive subject a partner, here seated in the third position, who also gives the correct response.
1. 1. 2. 1. 2.
With a partner, yielding drops to only 5% of the critical trials compared to 37% without a partner. Although subjects report warmth and good feeling toward the partner, they typically deny that he played a role in their own independence. The partnership variation shows that much of the power of the group came not merely from its numbers, but from the unanimity of its opposition. When that unanimity is punctured, the group's power is greatly reduced. Sometimes we go along with the group because what they say convinces us they are right. This is called informational conformity. But sometimes we conform because we are apprehensive that the group will disapprove if we are deviant. This is called normative conformity. The strength of the normative factor is shown in another variation carried out by Asch. In this variation, the subject is told that because he had arrived late, he would have to write his answers. Subjects in this private response experiment are exposed to the same amount of misleading information as other subjects, but they are immune from any possible criticism by the group.
1. 1. 1.
And this enormously reduces the pressure to conform. Conformity drops by 2/3. Asch's experiment is a classic. It reveals how people will deny what they see and submit to group pressure. It allows us not only to observe conformity, but to study the conditions that increase or reduce its occurrence.
What's amazing to me about this study is that, yes, 37% of the people in the initial condition, where they were the only ones actually being studied in the experiment, 37% of them conformed. 63% didn't, which is a lot. It's the majority, but it's still pretty remarkable that 37% of the time, an individual would go along with the group on something as obvious as the length of a line. So his work became the standard for hundreds of later experiments They did some comparing when the experiment was done. Asch's study was done in the 1950s, a time of high conformity in our culture. And when we look at the results from the 60s and 70s, we did find that conformity dropped. It would be very interesting to see these repeated today. What do you imagine we saw between the difference between collectivistic cultures and individualistic cultures? Probably, as you may guess, in collectivistic cultures, conformity goes way up. Because again, in a collectivistic culture, it's about the group, and your desire is to not stand out from the group. When they do this study looking at women versus men, women were more likely to conform than men. Asch's study overall lacked, remember from Module 1, that mundane realism. This isn't a good replication of a situation in which we might face conformity on a day-to-day basis. But it did have that experimental realism, that idea that people are going to be engaged in the task, and they certainly were in Asch's study. While not in your book, I came across a study that I find to be fascinating that was conducted a few years back using an fMRI. So remember, an fMRI, functional MRI machine, is able to track the use of oxygen in various parts of the brain to determine what parts are working. And so what they did was they put people in a very, very similar situation, except they were lying in an MRI machine. They showed them some spatial tasks, so some simple rotating of a 3D figure, and the answers were obvious. More obvious than this. This was the best example I can find, but it was actually an easier task than that. So they had an accomplice in the room and confederate, and when that person gave the wrong answer, the subjects also gave the wrong answer 41% of the time. So a little bit higher than what we saw in Asch's study, but it could involve some other factors, obviously not exactly similar, given that somebody was in an MRI machine. But what the most interesting part about this study is what they anticipated, what brain parts they anticipated to be active, and they found that they were actually quite wrong. So the hypothesis was that when someone was lying, when they were going along with the accomplice in the room and giving the wrong answer, that lying part of our brain would light up, the part that lights up when we do tell lies. But what was amazing is it didn't. What they found was that actually the parts associated with visual awareness and spatial perception lit up, which makes us think that what was actually happening is these individuals weren't lying, but rather they were modifying what their actual perceptions were so that what they would see would go along with what the others saw. Another really interesting tidbit learned from this was if they didn't conform, their amygdala lit up. What does our amygdala do? Those of you who had me for Gen Psych know I refer to her as Amy, and she's our emotional center, particularly fear and aggression, a lot of those negative emotions. So we got scared if we were not conforming, and that's a pretty interesting fact as well. And on the sidebar, they also had people give their answer against the computer. And if they did not conform with the computer's incorrect answer, those individuals' amygdalas did not light up.